Hello, everyone. I think we'll get started just a few minutes past the hour, but I'm sure more people will join us. I'd just like to say welcome to everybody to the first ANU Centre for Early Modern Studies seminar for the year, and to thank you all for coming. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I speak to you from the beautiful and unceded lands of the Ngambri and Ngunnawal peoples, and I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. I'm Ros Smith, and I'm the Director of the Centre for Early Modern Studies here at ANU, and I'm delighted to host a talk today by my colleague and friend in early modern women's writing, Professor Marie-Louise O'Coullahan. Before I introduce Marie-Louise, a little bit of housekeeping. We know you're going to have questions after Marie-Louise's talk, and you can either post them in the chat function or raise your hand to be unmuted so that you can ask questions yourself. I'll be moderating the discussion, ably assisted by Julie Hodgins, who runs this seminar series, also a member of CEMS, and Julie Rabarts, who's the research assistant for CEMS. So I hope we'll be able to allow you to ask questions in the form that you feel most comfortable in doing so. Either through the chat or in person is equally fine. We're all old hands at this now, so hopefully everything will go smoothly. Marie-Louise will talk for about 40 minutes, and then we have until 7:15 for questions and discussion. Marie-Louise O'Coullahan is one of the most exciting scholars working in early modern studies at the moment, and we're really honoured to have her to launch our seminar series for 2022. She's Professor of English at the National University of Ireland, Galway, and the author of Women, Writing and Language in Early Modern Ireland, published by Oxford University Press in 2010. Co-editor with Gillian Wright of the collection Catherine Phillips, Form, Reception and Literary Contexts, published by Routledge in 2018. And most recently, editor of a special issue of Duke University's Journal of Medieval and Early Modern Studies on the cultural dynamics of reception in 2020. Her field-defining work on 17th century women's writing in Ireland, on female authorship, reputation and reception, on book ownership, and on the use of quantitative methodologies in conjunction with qualitative analysis, has been published in journals such as the 17th Century, Criticism, Critical Quarterly, Huntington Library Quarterly, Early Modern Women and Women's Writing, as well as in many essay collections. Most pertinent to her talk today, however, is her role as principal investigator of the European Research Council funded project ReCirc, the reception and circulation of early modern women's writing 1550 to 1700. This enormous project, begun in 2014 and involving multiple postdoctoral researchers working in archives across the globe, has just concluded, and today she's talking about some of the results of that research today in a paper entitled Patterns, Outliers and Teasers, Questions and Challenges for the Reception of Early Modern Women's Writing. Thanks, Marie-Louise.
Thank you so much, Ros, and thanks for the invitation and that very generous introduction. Probably too generous, but thanks very much. And thanks to everyone for coming. I have to say, when I was talking to my colleagues yesterday saying I was giving a paper in Australia tomorrow, part of me was very sad that I wasn't able to physically be in Canberra, but at least it means I think that as a group we can all gather in a way that we mightn't have been able to do if it was in person only. So thanks very much for the invitation. I want to open with some basic but key questions. Which women writers were in circulation in the early modern period? Where did their texts go and who read them? How were they read, used or recycled? And these questions reflect a shift from the theorization of the reader to the historicization of readers. Where reader response criticism sought to categorise universal models for the reader, such as Wolfgang Iser's implied versus actual reader, early modernists working in the field have built upon Lisa Jardine and Anthony Grafton's seminal study of male scholarly reading and developed a more materialist approach that uncovers how imagined actual readers, in Bill Sherman's terms, or less extraordinary readers, in Heidi Bremen-Hackel's terms, went about the act of reading in this period. As book history has turned to the history of reading and feminist recovery research to questions of impact, scholars have combined the two to investigate the contemporary and posthumous effects of women who read and wrote in the 16th and 17th centuries. This productive intersection of disciplines and interests has tended to focus more on the history of women as readers rather than on how women writers were read. This was, of course, a necessary corrective to studies that had prioritised learned male readers. As Heidi Brayman-Hackle and Catherine Kelly wrote in 2008, the field of women's reading is comparatively undeveloped for the periods before 1800, and that's a deficiency that has been considerably remedied since. That scholarship on women's reading has pursued four main trajectories: prescriptions about female readers, direct addresses to women as patrons and readers, literary representations of women reading, and the archival material history of women as readers. Now, the history of how women writers were read is distinct, of course, from the history of women as readers, although they're not mutually exclusive. We might, for example, be interested in the overlapping space where women are reading women. Reading itself, moreover, is not the whole picture of the reception of female authored texts. Reception captures all forms of impact, including and beyond reading. It involves a range of different agents, it's recorded in multiple sources, and the genres of those sources shape the mode, the form of reception that's taking place. So I want to start today by discussing how we might model reception practices of the early modern period, and then consider the agents and the types of reception rooted in my experience leading the research project on the reception and circulation of early modern women's writing. Then I'll offer a snapshot of research findings so far, looking at the different ways that we've begun to analyse them. And I'll conclude by presenting some ways of thinking about outliers, how they challenge the patterns that we think we're seeing and prompt us to rethink the questions that we ask. So firstly then, to think about some models for reception practice in the early modern period. The dominant model for understanding a reader's agenda, what the reader is reading for, has been the utilitarian for-action prototype, first established by Jardine and Grafton. This was grounded in the humanist reading of Gabriel Harvey, the scholar, as he read his Livy, his classical reading. And as such, that understanding of the reader's approach to the text is immersed in humanist ideas of education and leans towards men and male reading. As scholars have excavated the world of women readers, that model has been extended, notably by Julie Crawford, whose analysis of Margaret Hoby's reading as being goal-directed argues that Hoby's diary is, quote, best understood as a record of a public career, and her reading as a form of political activism. So this template then reflects the reading practices of those who are annotating and commenting upon the textual content. But there are alternative models that better describe other reception practices. The transcription of a text, for example, is a function of a conservationist impulse, the urge to preserve and conserve it. Its compilation in a manuscript, juxtaposed with other cognate texts, might serve a memorializing purpose. And the next image that I have here illustrates this. This is an instance where the compiler of British Library Ad Manuscript 29921 has placed 3 elegies on Queen Elizabeth's death together. So we have at the top of the page, upon the death of Queen Elizabeth, then on the same and on the same. And so we might argue that as a model of reception, this is actually memorialization rather than for action or goal directed. Annotations can also be performative, as Micheline White has argued of Catherine Parr's practice. Self-fashioning and an awareness of the wider courtly audience inform her method. White writes that Parr's signature can be read as a visible marker that announces her commitment to humanist ideals, and that identifies her as a part of a community of cutting-edge, forward-thinking reformist readers. A similar principle of monarchical self-construction is detected by Roz Smith, whose discussion of Mary Stuart's marginalia in her manuscript Book of Hours identifies its rippling impact. Smith writes, its circulation among her peers as a tool of alliance or remembrance, and its use as a means of disseminating her secular poetry, mean that it could never be an apolitical, private, and domestic text. And part of the point here is that the layers of reception pile up in these instances. Parr and Stuart are monarchs who are on the one hand receivers, they're receiving devotional texts, but their marginalia signal their own religio-political affiliations. Their acts of reception were themselves received on another layer, and their acts of self-definition performed in the full knowledge that their marginalia would enjoy an audience of courtier reader-receivers. The level of agency and self-awareness inherent in this alerts us to reception's immersion also in the creative practice of writing itself. Reading stimulates writing. Reception becomes production. Both Sasha Roberts and Stephen Orgel highlight the reader's insertion of the self into the text, echoing each other. Roberts writes about readers who, quote, copied, corrected, commonplaced, applied, annotated, amended, reformatted, reworked, and responded to Shakespeare's poems. And in doing so, she says, they made them their own. And Orgel writes that you made yourself part of your book. This transmutation of the text into an artifact of the self derives from the reader's own sense of agency and picks up on the perception of marginalia as a form of life writing, one of many facets of marginalia that's being explored in Roz's Marginalia and the Early Modern Woman Writer project with you at ANU. This cause and effect relationship between reception and creative practice was embedded in early modern education systems. Indeed, Bremen Hackle identifies this as a key concern that underpinned anxieties about women as readers, in particular relation to women's authorship of genres like translation. That creative potential inherent in reception is also remarked by Kathy Aitchison, who writes, far from being derivative and dependent, marginalia are innovative and opportunistic, opening up the possibility of further transformation of the materials of writing and reading into acts of communication, works of literature, and interventions in the world of learning. So in summary then, the models for reception practice I've been outlining are 5. We have a goal-directed mode of reception, conservation as the impulse behind reception, memorialization, performance, and creative practice. We might then move on to think about the types of reception and the roles involved for the receiver. The receiver here, I'm using receiver as a term for the person who is engaged in the act of reception. And that person has agency. The types of reception map onto the roles embraced by the receiver, which are of the moment and may overlap. For example, William Brown, who wrote an elegy on Mary Sidney, beginning underneath this sable hearse, offers us an instance of poetic reception that is multi-layered in terms of agents. It's a poem that was copied into many manuscript miscellanies, so miscellaneous compilations of texts in a manuscript. Among them, one that I'm just going to show you here as we've kind of codified it in the research database. So what you have on the right is a screenshot of what you would find if you put this, if you located this record in the research database. And what this is trying to record is that Richard Boyle, who is the compiler of the manuscript, has compiled William Brown's poem about Mary Sidney. And we're triangulating that visually to try and separate out the different roles, because both Brown, the elegist, and Boyle, the compiler, are engaging with Mary Sidney in different ways. So in order to distinguish the levels of responsibility, what we did in research was that we separated their roles according to scale. Those responsible for the large-scale source, the manuscript in which it occurs, are labelled by us owner/compiler/scribe, and that's how you can see Boyle at the top of the screen labelled. as opposed to those who are responsible for the individual item of reception evidence that occurs within the source, which is the poem. In this example, that's Brown, who is labelled a receiver rather than an owner, compiler, scribe. I should also say that as well as tagging this evidence according to agents and source and type of reception and triangulating it in order to separate out all of the agents involved but linking them to each other. We've also tried to facilitate qualitative research. So if you were to scroll further down on the screen, what you would find then is a transcription of the poem as it occurs in this source and an image on the right. And we have, with thanks to the Folger Shakespeare Library and also the Hartlib papers, we've been given permission to show those images on the database. So in terms of then the agents, we have different layers of agents involved in reception, and the type of reception that's occurring further nuances the receiver. The receiver could be an annotator, a translator, a performer, a painter, a writer. And these are categories that contain as well as refine the paradigmatic reader. The role of the agent of reception might overlap. The act that's being developed might be momentary rather than a consistent practice over time. So translating a text is an act immersed in its own moment rather than one being a translator in all one's acts of reception. And I suppose the point I'm trying to make there is that these roles are shifting rather than definitive, and that they reflect the very wide scope of activities that are entailed in reception practice. So the kinds of reception found then are determined to an important extent by where researchers look. The research project aimed to produce a quantitative large-scale picture of how women were received in the early modern period. And it involved, as Roz has always said, a large team. Not all of us, I think our developer, David Kelly, is not there, but this is an image of the team at its height. And so you get a sense of kind of how collaborative this project was and how many people it involved. Our remit included non-Anglophone as well as Anglophone writers. So long as they were being engaged with or received in the English-speaking world they were in. So we included all kinds of non-English speaking women writers in our lists. Writing itself was broadly interpreted to include all forms, letters and prayers, as well as verse and drama. We excluded accounts, recipes, and wills for logistical reasons, as warranting analysis on their own terms. And we sought large-scale sources in which we hypothesized we were most likely to find evidence of the reception of women. So we looked for the texts associated with the Catholic religious orders, texts associated with scientific correspondence networks. We looked to manuscript culture, and we looked to book ownership. So the project was divided into 4 work packages corresponding to 4 different categories of source material: convent writing, letters, manuscript miscellanies, and book lists. The first 3 of these were located in nominated collections where we anticipated that large amounts of material would be found. So Convent Archives, the Hartlib Papers Archive, and 4 libraries with major early modern manuscript collections: the Bodleian, the British Library, the Folger, and the Huntington Library. So the evidence of reception that we found was the product of a targeted set of decisions devised in relation to source material. Exclusions as well as inclusions shape our findings. For example, single author manuscript collections, such as the Rosania manuscript of poems collected by Catherine Phillips, are omitted from our calculations, despite their rich evidence of the seriousness with which readers engaged with a woman's work. And that's because they're not miscellanies. Our work package was about manuscript miscellanies rather than single author manuscripts. So our research parameters have shaped these figures and findings in important ways. Our database is not exhaustive nor comprehensive, and it's limited according to our starting hypotheses as well as the termination of our funding period. Transparency about such factors is crucial to the representation of digital resources, as scholars such as Catherine Bode and Julia Flanders remind us, and as I'll pick up at the end of my talk. So let's think a little bit then about types of reception. For research, reception is defined as a record of engagement with a female author and or her work. And circulation was defined as a record of where a female authored work went. Our taxonomy of the types of reception was informed by such pioneering projects as the Reading Experience database and refined with reference to works like Peter Beale's Dictionary of Manuscript Terminology. The first iteration of our database was for us rather than for the public. It was researcher oriented. It was intended as a repository for us to share and compare what we were finding, especially as researchers were going to be in different archives around the world. And that first version allowed for 34 types of reception. But what I'm going to show you on the next slide is what we ended up with. And I'll talk a little bit about why there are 26 types of reception here rather than the 34 that we started out with. The aim initially was to minimise the need for subjective interpretation in the archive. So, for example, the single category poem captures all kinds of verse about or referring to a woman writer. And the point of that was to avoid researchers being sucked into time-intensive, interpretation-intensive decisions about whether a poem might be a panegyric or an epithalamium or both. So we just wanted to capture all the poems and be able to compare them rather than have people wasting time, well, spending time on that kind of interpretation in the archive, where we really wanted to just capture as much evidence as we could find. So that first list of 34 types of reception was preemptive. It was anticipating the kinds of evidence we thought we might find. But the public version of our database, and this is the 26 types of reception we have here, reflects what we actually did find. So we had to exclude those categories for which we found no evidence. And to give you some examples, that might include diagram, embroidery, reading aloud alone, reading silently in company. These were all categories that we had to jettison because we didn't find examples of them. The analysis phase, which I've been immersed in for the last couple of years, threw up at least 3 further categories that I wish that we had employed. And those are prayer, legal document, and context reference. And what I mean by context reference is the deployment of a woman writer's name as a temporal marker. For example, the specific year of Elizabeth's reign, or to position another person. So, for example, William Cecil, Elizabeth's Secretary of State. I would consider those to be context references to Elizabeth rather than references to her name as an author. And I wish we had included it. All 26 types of reception that you see in front of you here are defined along with the source genres in the About the Data section on the website. So I want to move on now to give you a snapshot of what we found, a snapshot of what the database contains. So we have, let me see, okay, here's our snapshot of our project findings, and I'll talk you through what these figures, what these numbers mean. The database contains 1,878 female authors from England, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, North America, the Low Countries, Denmark, Germany, France, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Greece should be in there as well, from classical times to the early modern period. So we were trying to contain all possible female authors who might be being received from the earliest times up to 1700. And we also wanted to be able to identify their works. So it also serves as kind of a catalogue of authors and works. At the moment, there are in it 7,319 female authored works. And I should say that, and you've got a list of all the possible genres that are included there on the slide. I should say that this includes individual works for all Anglophone writers. So each individual poem by Margaret Cavendish, for example, is in there as a separate work. But for non-Anglophone authors, we operated on the basis of printed volumes. And as and when we found reception evidence, we would enter individual poems by, say, Madeleine de Scuderi, as we found individual items of reception relating to those works. And that distinction is there really for logistical reasons. It would have been a whole huge multi-year project of its own to identify each individual work by every known author of the 1,878. The reason that we compiled these catalogues of authors and works was in order to have an easy list that could be checked when we were in the archive. So if a researcher was in the archive, that they could easily check, is this one of our women writers? Am I capturing this and putting it into the database, or is it not one of our women writers or one of our female authored works? So that's kind of the genesis of those catalogues of authors and works. So that in order that we could explore ideas about female authorship, we also swept up generic ladies and gentlewomen, as well as historically verified women. So we have people like a sad gentlewoman who's unidentified, as well as a historically verified author like Margaret Cavendish. And we did that deliberately because we weren't interested in getting into questions of whether this was really authored by a woman, but the fact that people thought it might have been authored by a woman or attributed it to a woman is what we wanted to capture in our kind of sweep of reception evidence. And so in terms of what we're left with after the 6 years of the project, we have 4,845 different receptions of female authors and their works by 678 identified people and many other anonymous people in 1,431 different sources. So the good news is that we've demonstrated that there is lots of material out there. But quantity is in the eye of the beholder. We're not in Franco Moretti's 7,000 titles terrain here, as most of the female authored works in our catalogue are not sadly represented by reception evidence in our database. But as I'm working through our qualitative analysis of these figures, it certainly feels like plenty to be getting on with. For example, across our corpus of manuscript miscellanies alone, Elizabeth I is the most commonly received of our authors, 405 times. When we search only for the category reference to named author, excluding all reference to specific work or reference to unspecified work, we find her occurring 322 times. And what this means is that her name is associated with her writing in only 83 of these instances. So only 20% of these instances is her name associated with her writing. Not perhaps too surprising given her status and longevity. Within the same corpus of manuscript miscellanies, we have a considerable number of women captured only once. For example, Folger manuscript VB 370, a rich cabinet or commonplace book, includes excerpts from printed histories of women, such as Thomas Heywood's account of the 15th century Italian poet Isotta Nogarola, and John Shirley's report, which you have here, on the ancient Greek poet Telesilla, as well as references to other women more numerously found in our corpus, such as Jane Grey, excerpted from John Fox. So this is just to give you an example of, again, the image and transcription screen for Shirley, who's being copied into this anonymous manuscript in writing about various women writers. We found reception evidence, to give you a sense of kind of the proportion of the full data set that we have. We found reception evidence for 22% of our list of all known female authors to 1700. So almost 80% of them we found no reception evidence for. But we found reception evidence for 22%. And of that 22%, 67%, so 2/3 of them were received twice or more, and 1/3, 33%, only once. So that maybe gives you a sense of the proportions and how they're shaping up in the whole data set. So I want to turn now to the question of book ownership, on which I worked with Mark Empey, who was the postdoctoral researcher working on that question. If we're thinking about book ownership, we might ask, who were the most popular women writers to have on bookshelves? And how might we profile the book owners who acquired their books? At present, research contains data relating to 51 various book lists and catalogues, mainly of the late 17th century. And that's largely because most of our sources are auction catalogues, and the advertising of libraries for auction is a phenomenon really of the later 17th century. And I can talk in more detail about that afterwards if people are interested. I should also say, of course, that to own a female-authored book is not necessarily to have read it, but we felt that book ownership can tell us about literary reputation and about which books we're translating, which books we're circulating, in what kind of juxtapositions and combinations, and in what kind of company. So it might be worth taking a moment here to consider who the most commonly circulated women writers were in the late 17th century English-speaking world. So maybe give that a little bit of thought for a second while I have some water. Okay, I'll show you what our top 10 is. It's worth, so of this top 10 then, kind of the headline figures, as you look through it, I'll talk you through maybe some of the headline figures. We can see that French authors predominate. 6 of our top 10 are French, 3 are English, 1 is Spanish. That's Teresa de Avila, who was a best-selling celebrity author at the time. One of the ways that I've divided the columns here is to give you a sense of the range of different titles that were in circulation. So the middle column shows you the number of books by this woman in our data set. So for example, we have records of 34 books by Madeleine de Scudéry in this data set of 51 different kinds of book lists. But it's not all the same book. There are 7 different of her works in circulation. You can see that again very clearly with Cavendish and Benn. So we have 31 different instances of Cavendish's books being owned, but 13 different titles by Cavendish are represented in that 31. Again, with that for Benn, we have 24 different examples of her books there. And of that 24, they represent 13 different of her titles out of the 28 that were feasible, that might have been in circulation. And you'll also see there with herself and Villedieu and Phillips that some of these lists don't specify which works. So in addition to 13 different titles by Benn, there's also 5 other works by Benn that are just listed as works by Benn. And I suppose the headline point there, again, maybe I could come back to this stuff in detail if people want afterwards. The headline point there with the distinctions I've made in those 2 columns is that these women writers were reaching book owners in all their genres of writing, philosophical and spiritual, as well as fiction and drama. So maybe I will just, or I don't have a list of Cavendish here, but anyway, so the point is that it's not just that only one title is being in circulation. You can see that maybe towards the bottom where someone like Marguerite de Valois, her memoir are the only work that was in circulation, that was available to be owned. But at the top end here, you can see that the prolific authors who were publishing different titles were being purchased and acquired in that range of different titles, rather than any one work, like say The Blazing World, which is so associated with Cavendish nowadays, predominating. The top 10 here also fits with Léon Cottagny's observation that French heroic prose romance was immensely popular in England from the 1650s. This is partly because, of course, the Restoration court had spent so much time in France during the interregnum, absorbing and admiring the sophistication of French culture and women-centred salon. It's worth also maybe noting before I move on that original language versions were in circulation just as much as English translations when you break this down. Okay, so if that's the headline figure of top 10s, what do we do with this? One avenue of pursuit would be the book owners themselves. What kind of book owner owned books authored by women? That's an exciting, it is an exciting time to be pursuing that line of research, given the kind of explosion of interest in book ownership in recent years. So in the top left of the slide here, you can see a screenshot from the Early Modern Female Book Ownership blog led by Martine van Elk, which was founded in December 2018. On the top right, you can see a screenshot from the Folger Library's Luna screen, which is relating to the release last year of Georgiana Ziegler's research on over 1,000 titles in the Folger Library that bear women's ownership inscriptions. In the bottom left, you can see David Pearson's also online compilation of book owners online, launched in August 2020. In the middle, you can see a collection published in 2020 on women's bookscapes in early modern Britain. And the bottom right, just the logo for private libraries in Renaissance England, led by Joe Black, which is also available as an online database via the Folger Shakespeare Library. So there's a lot of work being done on book ownership and that question of who might book owners have been at this point in time. And I'm just going to talk about one, mainly because of his Dublin connection. Thomas Scudamore was a Dubliner who died in 1698, and his large collection of 3,638 books was advertised for sale following his death at Dick's Coffee House in Skinner Row, which is now Christchurch Place in Dublin, for anyone who knows it. The image you have here is Daly's Coffee House, which occupied the same site as Dick's Coffee House in the 18th century. The Dublin book trade, incidentally, was very competitive and fractious in these years. If you're interested in reading up about it, I recommend John Dunton's account called The Dublin Scuffle, also published in 1698, of his experiences as a bookseller in Dublin. The seller of Scudamore's collection, John Ware, prominently advertised his probity in bringing to market this bibliophile's complete library. And Scudamore was certainly a bibliophile. We're told, and this is the quote here on the slide, that he was courted not a little by many of the best in this city for his advice in the most ingenious books and their exact editions. And such was the curiosity of this learned man that he used almost daily to walk his rounds through the shops and auctions, that something rare or valuable might escape his search. Many works of theology, classics and history are listed in this auction catalogue, as are a lesser number of philology and mathematics, plays and poetry. In terms of women's writing, the catalogue betrays a very specific interest in the mother's legacy. Scudamore owned 2 copies of Elizabeth Jocelyn's Mother's Legacy and one of Dorothy Lee's The Mother's Blessing. He also procured a 1680 copy of Madeleine de Scudéry's Conversations on Several Subjects in English translation. You'll remember she's the #1 in our top 10 list. Now, this brings me to the question that I'm coming to the end, the last kind of issue that I want to discuss here, which is about the question of patterns and outliers, bestsellers and research parameters. Because these mother's legacies that Scudamore owned were early modern bestsellers. It's a genre of writing, as I'm sure everybody knows, ostensibly written as a spiritual advice to children by mothers fearing that they would die in childbirth. And they were early modern bestsellers. So these 2 books here that were owned by Scudamore, the book that you have on the left here, The Mother's Legacy, by Elizabeth Jocelyn, went through 8 different editions between 1624 and 1684. You have the title page of the second impression from 1624 there on the left. Lee's The Mother's Blessing went through 23 editions between 1616 and 1674. So these are definitely print bestsellers. But you'll notice that they are absent from our top 10 most circulated women writers in the late 17th century. Lee, on the right, figures in only one other of our book lists, that of Frances Wolferston. And Scudamore's 2 copies of Jocelyn on the left are the only instances we have in our book ownership dataset. Now, what does this mean? Their absence from our top 10 does not detract, obviously, from Lee and Jocelyn's evident popularity. It is to some degree a product of our research parameters, and this is why transparency about parameters is so important. It clarifies how those parameters shape the results that we have. But nor are Lee and Jocelyn outliers for research. 60% of the female authors that we've found in book lists and book catalogues are found only once in our data set. This suggests a nice fat bulge at the top, but also a very long tail. Its very length suggests that a much broader range of women's writing was in circulation than that popular top 10. If not depth, then breadth is what we have. The search for patterns I'm relating here sets one quantity, the most instances in which a single example occurs, against a different quantity, the large number of single instances. We might well look at those numbers and decide that the outlier is the top 10 rather than the long tail. What we find depends on what we ask and where we look. It's clear that research design, our decisions about where to look, have shaped our findings. There are 4 different search routes available in our open access database, and each draws on a different data set: receptions, sources of reception, people, and writings by women. Within these 4 different search routes, various filters can be applied: types of reception, for example, or types of circulation, or a free text search of our transcriptions, which you can get by selecting our transcription field. So for example, I did a quick check last week, and if you look for the term love in that free text field, you get 517 different results, but it's up to you then to parse them. We might ask what an outlier is, and the answer depends on our perspective and the dataset's context. For example, and this is the last slide I'll show you, we have one piece of reception evidence that's been categorized as reading aloud in company. We had to cut out the various other kinds of reading alouds because we didn't find any examples. This example occurs in an anonymous account of a great controversy in the Benedictine convent in Brussels between Abbess Mary Percy and her sisters, who were engaged in a bitter battle for control over the convent, centered over whether their confessors should be Jesuits or secular priests. And in this account, what we have is a relation of the nuns drawing on and disputing via texts and via reading. And the specific thing that's happening here is a 1632 election convened by the Abbess Mary Percy, and another faction of the convent don't want the election to go ahead. And what they do is they resort to text and to reading. We're told, all being present, we besought her ladyship, the abbess, to give us leave to read a writing which we brought with us. And her ladyship not denying it, we began to read it. But instantly 2 of the other party in great passion flew upon the reader and tore the paper so that it could not be read. Notwithstanding, the lady abbess willed them twice or thrice to desist and let the paper be read. Then we related by word of mouth the contents of it, which was that we did protest against the new election during our appeal as unjust and against the holy canons. So we have here a collectively produced text and its communal reading. These are not outliers. They are typical of the modes of convent textual production, and they were central to convent disputes. But this type of reception occurs only once in Research's database. It offers us the spectacle of women reading and debating female-authored texts, but its singularity in our dataset is not reflective of a rarity of practice. Playing with numbers throws up different patterns and different gaps, but we still need to drill down to do the qualitative work. Reflecting in 2017 on her experience writing the Oxford English Literary History, Margaret Isell warned against the illusion of comprehensivity implicit in large-scale databases. She warned that it reinforces a belief that if you don't find something, an author, a text, and a document in these massive digital repositories, it did not exist, leading once again to the past being defined by what it does not have, by absence. Now more than ever, we are conscious of the absences in our histories, which do not reflect the evidence if we go looking for it. It's crucial then for me to highlight our gaps, to draw attention to the categories that we did not find, but others might find, and complicate what patterns and outliers are. Research database is not comprehensive, but it throws up an array of patterns, sometimes dizzying patterns. These serve as outlines for our understanding of the ways in which early modern book owners and readers acquired and received texts produced by female authors. The current iteration of our online resource is the beta version that was launched in 2020. Like so many other projects, the pandemic has held up our ability to get to the alpha version. I'd like to invite you to play around with it, with the very unfortunate proviso that it was migrating server last Friday and something has gone wrong with that. So if you try to look at it today, you'll get a category error, which is deeply frustrating, and I tried to get fixed before speaking to you today. However, I am assured it will be fixed in a matter of days. But my point, I guess, about the beta version is that I'd invite you to play around with it and give us feedback, because we're still planning to do a major kind of overhaul and improve it. So we very much invite you to let us know how you find it as users. I guess at this stage I've run out of time, and I'd like to thank you for attention. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Thanks, Marie-Louise. That was great. So interesting, and such an intriguing amount of evidence that you've now got to work through. I'm going to ask people to, I've actually said put your questions in the chat, but of course put them in the Q&A. It would be the best method, or raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question. While everyone's gathering their thoughts, I have many a question for you, Marie-Louise, but I'm going to start off with one that's actually kind of one taking you right back to the beginning of this project, because I think one of the really interesting things about this paper are the things you're saying about transparency of category. And as someone sort of working on starting a big digital project myself, I'm very interested in kind of how you determined the research parameters that have shaped this project, why you kind of landed on book lists, manuscript miscellanies, convent writing and letters, kind of whether you think that they were the right choices. If you'd made some other categories, would it have turned out differently? Do you think now in the benefit of hindsight? Yeah, just a little bit more about what the processes of choosing those categories were and what impact you think they had on the project as a whole.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. So the genesis of the project, I suppose, it was a few years of me trying to, so the genesis of the project, I suppose, essentially came through being involved in a research network that was funded by the EU, which was people working on all kinds of women's writing up to 1900. Very few of us were early modernists, actually. And that research project became very interested in that question of reception and impact. And because so few of us were early modernists, and it was so clear that the methodologies that were being devised for the 19th century were absolutely not going to work for the earlier period, I started kind of talking to the handful of others going, but how would we really do this for the early modern period? So in particular, there was a colleague based in Spain and another colleague based in Portugal who became quite exercised as I did, as we tend to do when early modernists are in these much bigger scales and you're banging the drum for the earlier stuff. So over the course of a few years, I kind of started trying out different ways of using things like the universal short title catalogue was just coming online at that point, and trying to see, could I put Teresa de Avila in there, and would that show me translations of her work? And I mean, she's actually a great example because she's easy, because so much work has been done on her. You can kind of test out this stuff and then test it against the scholars of Teresa de Avila and see whether it works or not. So I spent a few years trying out those kinds of things. And I suppose the other genesis of it is my work before then had been in, my PhD was on manuscript miscellanies. I had become very interested in nuns' writing when I started researching women's writing in early modern Ireland. So it's probably actually also just that kind of derived from personal, I mean, we could dress that up as professional experience, but it's also personal interest, the stuff that I knew about. And so I was able, again, with the religious orders, I was able to test it out and find some kind of pilot studies of examples of women whose work had been translated transnationally usually not because it was of interest as a piece of women's writing, but it was of interest as a witness to the martyrdom of Catholics being murdered. And that's why it gains currency and gets translated into Italian and Latin and moves into a different kind of canon. So that's kind of the genesis of it, that I had done some preliminary pilot studies to check out whether this stuff would work, which is how I convinced them to give me the money in the end. In terms of would I choose different categories now, I don't think I would. And that's partly because there's clearly so much material that we couldn't look at. So for example, work package 2, which was about scientific correspondence. We started off with the Hartlib Circle, the kind of network, the social network surrounding Samuel Hartlib, because we knew there were a couple of women, Lady Ranelagh and Dorothy Moore-Jury, who were actively involved with them. And in the end, we never got beyond the Hartlib Circle, because what the postdocs found was so much material relating to women just within the Hartlib papers. Because I had also, grand plans of looking at Elizabeth of Bohemia's correspondence, but we just never got to that. And the manuscript miscellanies material, I really wish we'd looked at the Beinecke almost rather than the Huntington. The Huntington at that time didn't have an online catalogue, so Erin McCarthy kind of had to land there, and I went with her for a couple of weeks to go through the card catalogues and see what we could find. And I think that actually there would have been more material now in the Beinecke than there was in the Huntington. Mm-hmm. So I think probably what my answer would be is that we uncovered so much material that I'm sure there are other categories that one could look at, but we never got near exhausting the categories that we had.
Yeah, that's incredible. Yeah, it's so interesting. Okay, we've got heaps of questions. So unless, I'm just going to assume if you put it in the Q&A, I'll read it. And I've got people with their hands up as well. So I'll start with the Q&A. So this is from Claire Hansen. She says, thank you for this phenomenal presentation. This has been wonderful. When conceptualising early modern female readers, you mentioned early on the imagined reader. I think, apologies, I can't remember the exact quote. I was interested in this and wondered about what role, if any, this idea of the imagined reader or writer continues to play.
Yeah, that is interesting. And I suppose what we were looking at was kind of evidence of actual material readers. So I was quoting there, the quote from the imagined actual reader is from Bill Sherman, whose book Used Books I highly recommend. It's been very field defining. Used Books, when did it come out? It's probably about 10 years old now. William Sherman, Sherman. I'll type it in a minute. Used Books. And he talks about and conceptualizes the kind of, he's got a really meaty introduction and opening chapter that are all about conceptualizing this stuff and positioning what he's doing in relation to that earlier generation of reader response theorists. So someone like Wolfgang Iser, I also mentioned, as an example of, if you Google kind of reader response theory, you'll find people like Iser and Stanley Fish kind of writing in the 70s, Hans Robert Jauss as well, writing in the 70s and the 80s about theories of what the reader is and the reader does. And they're interested in that kind of universal model of the reader. And the shift that I was arguing for that's happened kind of in the early 2000s, certainly in early modern studies, and you could argue earlier, is away from that kind of universal model of the reader to try and find more paradigmatic, multiple kinds of readers. And so that idea of the imagined reader is mainly addressed, I would say, by people like Bill Sherman, Heidi Brayman-Hackle. Edith Snook's book also does some great work on this, about the ways in which early modern writers conceived of readers. So that's kind of, the kinds of material you're looking at there, kind of paratextual addresses to the reader, prescriptions about readers. So that kind of idea of the early modern imagining of what a reader should be. And in many ways, that's kind of an ideal reader too. Who is my ideal reader? Who is the kind of reader I want? Who's the kind of reader I don't want? There's been a lot of work done on this also. I'm thinking of Wendy Wall in particular, but probably other people since her, looking at the early print anthologies and how they conceived of the readers of print miscellanies of poetry, you know, and that idea of very self-consciously democratizing the kind of reader that they were hoping to find, and the gentleman reader versus the real reader. So that kind of conceptualizing and imagining of readers isn't what we're doing, but it's a very interesting kind of parallel dimension. And so, like, say, Edith Snook, Bill Sherman, Heidi Bremen-Hackle, Wendy Wall would be the places to go to for thinking about the imagined reader. And I suppose what we were doing then is we were trying to go to kind of from the ground up to look at, well, what kinds of readers do we have? And the stuff I was doing at the start, trying to taxonomize the kinds of reception and the kinds of receiver, is all based on that kind of ground up. You know, when we look at these masses of materials, what are the patterns that we see, and what kinds of readers, what kinds of reading are they doing? So that's maybe at the opposite end of the scale to the imagining of the reader, by trying to look in a very material historicist way at what kinds of reading are they engaging in.
Thanks, Marie-Louise. So the next question is from Kate Flaherty, and she says, thanks, Marie-Louise. I really liked how you articulated necessary caution about how to interpret what's not there in the data. Were there any big surprises about what is there? What expectations were overturned by what the data revealed?
That's a great question too. I'm probably... probably the expectation that was overturned is, if I think of something like the top 10 slide I showed you there, that actually wasn't very surprising to me. So, like, the surprise was how unsurprising some of the patterns were. And that's probably why I've ended up doing a lot more digging around in that long tail I was talking about. To me, once you kind of understand kind of that French heroic romance was kind of huge in the late 17th century in England, the dominance of French female authors there isn't that surprising. Teresa d'Avila is not that surprising either. So I guess at that level, with the kind of top 10 stuff, certainly with book ownership, what we're doing, I'd say, is kind of fleshing out and giving greater texture to what we might have had a hunch was the case already. But what I find more surprising is that huge range of stuff that's kind of evading the pattern. You know, that 2/3 of the female author books that we're finding are only occurring once or twice. So you're not getting kind of multiple big numbers, but you're getting a really, really wide range of women's writing that's in circulation. And so that's become kind of the more interesting thing for me. We're still parsing through. The big job that I have to do this summer is the manuscript miscellanies material, because with this stuff, you go down rabbit holes. You know, I think I spent all of last summer working on Elizabeth I. I had that slide there on, you know, the 405 instances that she comes up. I mean, that's by far the most of any woman writer. But the problem with this stuff is you then have to drill down qualitatively and go, well, what are these 405? What are the patterns within it? And it's just so various and so multi-textured that I ended up going down a huge rabbit hole with that. And I think I was trying to write kind of a section of a chapter on it, but it ended up being something like 20,000 words on its own. So my job this summer is to go back to the manuscript miscellanies and stop getting sidetracked by that kind of material. So, I mean, that's kind of a long and rambling answer to your question, which is, I suppose, really, in essence, that we're still, you know, the quantitative big picture, the numbers stuff you can do. The drilling down as to what that actually means is taking an awful lot longer. And, you know, the good thing about that is it's a testimony to how rich the stuff is. The disappointing bit is it's taking me a really long time to figure it out.
Thanks, Marie-Louise. Okay, so I have a hand up here in the participants, and that's Kelly Payhoper. I've allowed you to chat, Kelly.
Hi, thanks for just a great presentation. I'm doing a PhD on attribution, reception, circulation, so it was very interesting for me. I was wondering, with this research you've been doing, have any of your ideas of authorship expanded? And are you going to, I suppose, do further research on different ways women contributed to authorship in different ways? And coming off from that, are there any really exciting female authors in the future you intend to introduce the world to through this project that we don't know about yet?
Thank you. That's great. To answer the second one first, unfortunately, no. This is one of the things I'd hoped that we would find a Hester Poulter. We haven't really found a Hester Poulter. It turns out there are very few of those. So no, the answer is there isn't some amazing, exciting, undiscovered author that we've managed to uncover. It doesn't mean they're not out there. In terms of ideas of authorship, yeah, one of the things that we're, the other job we're doing this summer is, so myself and two of the postdocs are co-writing a book on reception in the manuscript miscellany particularly, and that's with Erin McCarthy and Sajed Chowdhury. And Erin and I have been doing a lot of work and trying to think through all of these gendered but probably anonymous. What does anonymous authorship mean? What does pseudonymous authorship mean? What does it mean to say that a poem like this, a poem of heartbreak, is by a sad gentlewoman? And I know Roz has done a fair bit of work in this in terms of the Anne Vavasor poems, and that kind of question of attribution and authorship, and where are the blurred lines? And one of the interesting things about coming at this, as you are too, Kelly, from the question of attribution and reception, is you don't really have to get bogged down in questions of feminist recovery research of, is this by an actual woman? You can kind of divorce yourself from that and go, well, what about people's general ideas of female authorship? In what circumstances, what kinds of poems tend to get attributed to women? And are there patterns to that? And is that just really a rhetorically effective speech act for the manuscript compiler? You know, it works for the manuscript itself and for the performance that the manuscript compiler is doing to say that this is by sad gentlewoman, or we have a number in the database of ladies of quality. I think we have about 5 of them. So we had to kind of go lady of quality 1, lady of quality 2. You know, is there a pattern about kind of the lady of quality and the circumstances in which receivers are attributing the idea of or constructing the idea of female authorship in association with these kinds of works? So that's the direction we've been going in with that. And Erin and I co-wrote a chapter in the complaints book that was edited by Sarah Ross and Roz a couple of years ago, that was starting to think that through in terms of digital representation. How do we digitally represent an author who's probably not female, who's probably pseudonymous, but you nevertheless want to capture that sense of the idea of gendered authorship that's in circulation. So Kelly, I don't have a hard and fast answer for you, but it's a question that we're really centrally concerned with at the moment.
I love that answer, because that's how I've come to it as well, with the help of some of your theories on reception of lost women's works and stuff. So
great.
I'm on the right path. No, that's great. That's fantastic.
Keep me posted on your work. I'll be interested in seeing how your own ideas for this develop, you know, because it's a conversation we're having really at the minute.
Yeah, and I'm having it with your and Roz's scholarship on that too. So thanks so much.
Okay.
Yeah.
It is such an interesting question. I think it's one of the most interesting things about the research project is how you've kind of expanded those models of authorship to include, you know, ones that aren't linked to historical women writers. Like, it's kind of a super radical choice, but such an interesting and rich choice as well. I cannot wait to see what you and Erin come up with, you know, in the monograph and such. So we've got a question from Paul Saltzman here. He says, can you say a bit more about how research parses the relationship between distant and close reading? I'm thinking of how, for example, the materialist interest in individual volumes can be related to some of the categories research put into circulation. And maybe related to this, if you have an example like Roth's Urania, where we have one example of Roth reading her own book and correcting it, how can that be categorized?
That's a really rich series of questions. Can I do justice to them? Thanks a million, Paul. I mean, I think what on a database level, what research has been trying to do is facilitate both distant reading and close reading. And I suppose my complaints about how long it takes is that the close reading takes as long as it always did, you know. But I don't think well, in my analysis phase of it, I mean, other people can use the material how they want. I don't think I can do the distant reading without also doing the close reading, you know, because the distant reading only brings me so far. I have to still kind of do that close reading. And on a database level, by including the transcription and the image, we've tried to enable people to do qualitative close reading, as well as the kind of distant reading that they might want to do. And the database, when it's back up and running, offers people there's kind of a pane of interesting searches where we've done some of the distant reading, some of the quantitative stuff for you, just to give people a sense of, oh, I could ask this question of the database. But as you devise your own questions, you can also then extract them, export them as a spreadsheet and play around with them yourself and do things with them. So we're trying to enable users to do their own distant reading with kind of different kinds of categories, as well as leaving the basic material there so that the close reading can be done. So that's maybe the very basic pragmatic answer to what's a much more layered question. So let me think through the example like Roth's Urania, where we have Roth reading her own book. How can that be categorized? Right, so one of the ways that we would be able to retrieve, well, one of the ways in which we wouldn't be capturing that is that it's not conforming to one of our categories of source, you know, Roth's copy of her own printed book. How would we have come across, I'm trying to think, is there a way that we would have come across that in our methodology? And I don't think we would. Printed books with annotations on them, unless they were in a conference library. The book ownership stuff that we're looking at lists of books owned rather than the individual copies that people owned. And I know that's something that Betty Hageman is really annoyed with me for not doing for Catherine Phillips. So I don't think we would have found that example, which is part of the value of sharing all this stuff, you know, and sharing the types of reception we didn't find, because just because we didn't find them doesn't mean that people won't find them in future, you know, that another iteration of, as we're building up this picture of what was early modern reception, and, you know, ideally not even as related to women's writing, you know, what was early modern reception? We're not the final word on it, but I hope that we have moved that on to a certain degree, and that people who are interested in that might be able to move it on a bit further. We might come to an ever better account of what early modern reading was and early modern reception was. But to come back to the Roth example, as I ramble, I mean, there are ways of searching the database to look for female readers. So you can separate out female readers and male readers. So you would be able to retrieve all the instances we have of a female reader. And because it's only about the reading of women's writing, that's a female reader of women's writing. And so that's one of the kind of sets of results that you could come across, and then start parsing it. But I don't think we would have found, in a similar way to the example I was using there of the single author manuscript collections of Catherine Phillips, we didn't look at single author manuscript collections. So, you know, there's a lot to be done on that, but they're not in research.
We have a lot, in a way, my marginalia project sort of is building on your project in some ways. So something like that would be captured. Now I have a question here from Tricia Pender. I'm going to allow you to talk, Tricia.
Hi, Trish.
Hi, Marie-Louise. It is beautiful to hear you talking and your accent and all the excitement of this project. It's really, really invigorating just to hear you present on it. I wanted to ask a kind of simple question, but it could be kind of open-ended. It feels like you've uncovered material that you could study for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
And I guess my question is, given the parameters that you set, are there some questions, research questions, that really produced exciting results for you, and other research questions that were just like, I wish we hadn't, you know, like that one kind of didn't go anywhere, I guess. In terms of like asking questions of the field and what your experience has been.
Wow, that's a huge one. Yeah, well, your first observation is bang on. It is definitely material that one could work on for the rest of one's life. And I'm not sure I quite want to do that, but I'm still kind of enjoying it for the moment. And it's been handy in a pandemic, actually, to have a database of primary materials there to work with, rather than, you know, being cut off from visiting archives and that kind of thing. Are there questions that didn't go anywhere? Let me see now. Are there questions that didn't go anywhere? I think probably my difficulty in answering that suggests that the answer is no, that they all went somewhere. But I'm still trying to figure out where it is that some of them are going. So let me think. I mean, the opening questions that I had there, which women writers were in circulation, where did their texts go, who read them? I mean, I'm still parsing all of that. That's actually probably, and that goes to your original thing, is like you could have a lifetime's work here. And part of me wants to get on with producing the couple of big books on it to just at least get, I think that the rabbit hole problem is that I realized is that you can just get into, you know, you want to get stuck in such depth, but actually with this range of material, it's probably a better idea not to get stuck in depth and, you know, navigate your route through it and get something out there that puts a paradigm and a framework out there that you or someone else can then come back to if necessary. So that's probably been my big challenge. And all I can think of as I try and answer your question, Tricia, is not the questions that didn't go anywhere, but all the things that we didn't manage to fully follow through on. And so, you know, the convent archive stuff, really in the end, we thought there had been so much work done on one set of archives that Emily Murphy, who did most of the archival work, and that went to the big archive in Belgium, which hadn't been thoroughly investigated. And a bit like the Hartlib papers, she never got thoroughly beyond that because there was so much in that convent archive about the nuns because they fought with each other all the time. So, you know, once you kind of broaden out your sense of what women's writing is, and so, you know, producing letters and texts to the Archbishop complaining about, and, you know, we wanted to capture references to women as well. So once you have all of those nuns as writers, because they all authored something, every time that they are referred to, you're capturing it in the database, which maybe in a way gives them a disproportionate prominence amongst groups of nuns, but as a kind of a case study group or community, it shows you just how much circulation and recirculation within the community and outside the community to the archdiocese was going on. So I think probably my real feeling about it is that there's so much material that we found that actually none of the parameters I've been identifying have been fully followed through, you know, and you kind of just have to stop, probably as we'll have to stop shortly, just because the time runs out and the funding runs out, you know. And I suppose the other last thing I would say, one of the questions that I had quite early on was, would I try and move to a crowd-sourced model like the Reading Experience database did, of just keeping the database open and keep adding to it? And I really wanted to do that for a while, but ultimately I realized that then you're into quality assurance, that I would have to check everything that comes in to make sure it's not compromising the quality of the data that's already in there. And that would be kind of a life sentence in a way. So like trying to find ways of making these projects sustainable and open to be added to in a way that's manageable for the people who are involved is a big question for probably another day as well.
Yeah, thank you. That makes so much sense. And I just want to say the whole project already has changed the shape of the reception of early modern women's writing. The fact that you have internationalized it beyond the Anglophone world is a huge shift. And I think we'll be talking about it for a long time.
Oh, thank you so much, Tricia. That means a lot. Thanks a million. Thank you. And it's great to hear your voice too. I only wish we could be in person, but we will be someday.
Soon. Yeah. Come out. We've just got one more question, and this is from Sarah Ross, and then I'll allow everyone to go off into their lives. So Sarah says, thank you, Marie-Louise. Like many, I've been following your work throughout, and I never cease to learn more every time I hear you speak on it. Could I ask a couple of quite specific questions about categories? First, you mentioned context reference as a category you wish you had included. Why do you wish this? What would it have added to your data, or how would it have enabled you to parse your data differently? And secondly, outlier, is this a purely statistical quantitative category here? I mean, Margaret Cavendish is an outlier in a qualitative sense because she created her own reception history through donating books. But is that a purely qualitative element for which you wouldn't use outlier?
That's a great question. Yeah, the outlier one, it's all about context, isn't it? You know, I mean, within the context of our data set, Cavendish is not an outlier, but of course, this is where the complications of qualitative reading come in. You kind of then go, okay, so she's in the top 10, but to what extent, as you rightly say, is that a self-construction of hers, you know, as a self, an insertion of the self into bibliographic history and into libraries. Although I should say, none of the libraries that we're looking at are university libraries. So the institutional places where she placed her books aren't included in our data set. I probably should have spoken, well, I would have made a longer paper to talk in detail about that data set. It's really kind of individuals, usually posthumous auction catalogues of deceased people whose libraries are being put up for sale, and some wills as well, but they're individuals rather than institutions. The context reference question is one that, again, it's only when you start doing the parsing through that you go, God, quite a lot of these are, and context reference is just my best way of describing it, especially when you're looking at queens. And I suppose, to come back to what I was saying, I spent a lot of last summer looking at Elizabeth. So many of the reference to named author that we have for Elizabeth is people talking about the 23rd year of her reign or something like that. And so it's not Elizabeth as an author in any way, or even Elizabeth as a personality. It's Elizabeth as a temporal marker, or as, you know, I was walking past a palace where Elizabeth once visited. That's not germane to the text. Elizabeth is the marker for place or for time or for social position or status. And it seemed to me that we have we do have an awful lot of that 405, a substantial percentage of those are context references. And I think it would have helped me to do the kind of the higher level macro analysis if we had been able to categorize those in that way initially, because and on a pragmatic level, I'm having to do it all by hand, whereas it could have been done by computer if we had had the category. But it seemed beyond that to be useful more broadly to put out there, because I think we probably would find as this kind of work evolves that having that category is a useful way of separating out the quality of the reception that's going on. So I hope that answers the question.
Great. Well, I think that's, I mean, we could probably, you know, I could talk about this all day. I'm sure many of us in the audience could, but I'd just like really to say a few thank yous. First of all, thanks to Christina Clark, Julie Hotchins and Julie Robarts, who do such a beautiful job of organising this seminar, publicising it, making everything run smoothly. You know, I greatly appreciate, and it's just such beautiful collaborative labour that you do for the centre and for the field. And thanks for everyone for coming and asking such great questions. And most of all, thanks to Marie-Louise for such a stimulating and interesting paper about a project that, you know, as Trish said, it really has been field defining and has changed the way we think about reception studies. And, you know, you should be congratulated for it. It's been wonderful.
Thank you so much, and thanks for those great questions. You'll have noticed me scribbling. This is all really useful for me as I'm trying to figure out what people are interested in when I'm writing it all up. So thank you, and thank you all for attending. It's been great to be in Australia for an hour and a half.
Okay, thanks everyone. See you all later. Bye.
Thanks everyone. Bye.